Our rules must be clear, our regulations must make sense, and our tax code must remain competitive with our neighbors. When energy prices tumble, it directly impacts the state's sales tax collection, the state's income tax collection, the gross production tax, and various other revenue streams. We must be honest with ourselves and recognize that last year's tax increases made us more dependent on the price of oil. We must be good fiscal stewards of this decision by creating more stability through savings.
The United States is now the #1 producer of oil and natural gas anywhere in the world. And now, for the first time in 65 years, we are a net exporter of energy.
And Oklahoma has played a key role in producing that oil and natural gas. Oil production here has nearly tripled in the past decade, improving Oklahoma's economy, and industry leaders say giving the U.S. an edge.
Absolutely. Saudi Arabia can't slap us around anymore and try to manipulate the oil and gas prices. They can't do it because the #1 producer and exporter is America.
You're listening to the new media. You're listening to Mitchell Talks. Learn more at MitchellTalks.com and follow me, Scott Mitchell, on Twitter at Mitchell Talks. It's episode 12 of the All of the Above Energy Podcast. The voices you heard in the opening were, of course, President Trump, Governor Stitt, Aaron Brillbeck of News 9, and Chad Warmington. He's the chief executive of the new trade group that emerged from the merger of the Oklahoma Oil and Gas Association and the Oklahoma Independent Petroleum Association late last year. In part 1 of this 3-part series recorded February 12th, Mr. Warmington discusses the merger and how policymakers have made the state more dependent on the volatile price of oil and gas. Further, you'll learn how this former chief of staff to 3 Oklahoma House speakers views Governor Stitt's plans for mitigating that dependence. Plus, he'll discuss Oklahoma's shaky business reputation for keeping promises to all forms of energy once they deploy capital in Oklahoma.
Merger's gone really well. And, when I've been running around the state, either talking to members or talking to different groups who are familiar with both organizations, I really like to point out you got really unique histories. OKOGA's 100th anniversary is this year. It was started in 1919 in Tulsa, Oklahoma. And OIPA was started in 1955 by 20 independent oil and gas men who felt like they needed, their voice represented. So, I think here we are in 2019. You've taken those two really unique histories and really different bodies and you've blended them together. And so, there'll be some growing pains, but at the end of the day, we represent almost all the production in the state of Oklahoma. And I think it's an important distinction because we need to speak with one voice at the Capitol and in the state's regulatory bodies, and we haven't been able to do that over the last couple of years. But when our executive committees got together and looked at the potential of doing it, they realized there was a lot of upside. And really the industry's changed over the last few years. There aren't as many, one-off small mom and pops that are drilling, hundreds or dozens of vertical wells in the state anymore. That's not how production occurs. And so we're all really drilling in the same way. We're drilling the same types of wells and really kind of the same expensive wells. It's just how many and how big those drilling programs are. So it really kind of lent itself to let's get together, let's be together on the policy issues and the tax issues that matter, and have one voice at the Capitol representing the oil and gas industry, and that was the real net benefit. I think one of the most unfortunate things, of the last couple of years was, really you had this decline in commodity prices, a significant decline down into the 30s. And, to go from the highs of 100 to the 30s was really a devastating move for not only our member companies, but for the state's budget. So you had these two events that happened together. And by the way, they're going to happen again. And that's what we'll talk about, what Governor Stitt talked about. And so you had an industry that was hurting and a state that was hurting, and it just compounded itself in terms of revenue shortfalls at the Capitol. And at the end of the day, the legislature chose to, tax the industry more in order to get themselves out of the hole. I'd argue that the hole was really beginning to fill, and the tax increase really hasn't helped all that much. It was frankly commodity prices recovering, the scoop in the stack leading the way that's kind of worked Oklahoma out of the hole. The additional revenue, sure. Is it nice for legislators to spend? I bet they'd say yes. I don't know that the people think that that's such a great thing. But it was just really a confluence of events that led to, the tax increases over the last few years. And I don't know that it was the legislature out to get the oil and gas industry as much as it was get teachers a pay raise that we all wanted to get them, get our heads above water, and really get a budget and go home was their mantra.
Then the next thing they did was
make themselves more dependent on GPT. What's really interesting is we did a study recently, and we can get Cody to show it to you, but we studied 16 other oil and gas producing states. And one of the metrics we looked at was their dependency on or their sensitivity to fluctuations in commodity prices. Oklahoma was top of the list. And this was pre the tax increases from 2018. And so Oklahoma was already very price dependent and already much more sensitive in our economy to fluctuations in the oil and gas industry. And that's what we were warning legislators. We're like, look, not only do you drive away economic activity, but you make the state now more dependent on this volatile source of revenue. And GPT, which became the mantra, is only 20% of the total revenue base that's generated from our industry. So not only that, you're talking about GPT, and you're not looking at the big picture of revenue that comes from our industry, which is sales tax, payroll tax, and all the ad valorem taxes, all the other associated taxes. They were just focused on the one thing that's tied to production, and that the one thing that's tied to a really volatile commodity price. And so they've now made themselves more dependent on us than ever before. And the governor, to his credit, pointed out in his State of the State, he said, let's not kid ourselves. We have made ourselves more dependent on the oil and gas industry. His pivot is that if we've done that, we need to be prudent and save for the next downturn, because there always is one. And his position is he doesn't want to get himself in the same situation that the previous governor did in the previous legislature, which spend themselves into a hole and then have no way out of it and no savings to help offset some of those revenue losses that come during an inevitable commodity price downturn. I think what's interesting is essentially what we warned was going to happen has happened. And if you look at from the beginning of December to February last week, Oklahoma's seen about a 20% decline in rig count, which is pretty significant. And you say, okay, well, that's commodity price driven. But if you look at other comparable states, Texas, 3% decline. New Mexico was 10% decline. So, if you look at our real competitors, Oklahoma, New Mexico, and Texas are really kind of the sweet spot. Oklahoma by far has had a larger percentage decline in rigs. And so it's not just a commodity price that's impacting that. I think it's the total cost of doing business in Oklahoma. And so exactly what we said was we were warning about was if you make it harder to make a dollar here, if your rate of return is lower than it is just across the border in New Mexico or just across the border in Texas, those capital dollars are going to flow there, and they are. And they vote, and the indicator is rig count. And Oklahoma's suffered a pretty significant decline, and hopefully it'll slow down. But a lot of our big service providers are predicting another 20%, which could be another 20 plus rigs. Now you're down in around 100 rigs. Things are starting to tighten up. So because you've made yourself more dependent on us, you've got to start figuring out where you're going to either get other sources of revenue, and that means diversify the economy, which we've been talking about since the 80s, and we haven't done it. So what's the quickest thing you can do? And that's what Governor Stitt's pivoting towards. Saving the money that we're making now. Don't go spend all the excess. Set it aside, in terms of a revenue stabilization account, so that when you get that inevitable dip, you can pull from reserves to get yourself through it until you get your uptick. The one law that's on the books that's not funded is called a revenue stabilization fund. And essentially it would have taken all of the revenue derived from oil and gas activity and put it into a fund that would then spill out into general revenue on a smooth rolling average. So you don't get the highs and lows of revenue to spend. You get a smooth out revenue allocation to general revenue. It controls your spending. And it says, we're not going to spend at the super high. We're not going to also be, devastating low. We're going to have this smooth amount of revenue coming out. They could do that. They could put in place controls that any other businesses do when it's a commodity-based business. And they anticipate the peaks and the valleys, and they have a spending program that kind of strikes somewhere in the middle. I think the beauty of having a business-minded governor is he gets that, and that's what he's proposing. And I think he laid down some pretty big markers that we're not going to go spend this surplus. We're going to do some things that are important. We're going to do another round of teacher pay raises. We're going to get real cost efficient on efficiency in government. We're not just going to go spend all this money and then in 2021 go, hey, where'd all the money go? And now, oil's at X dollars and we don't have the revenue we thought. Well, we better go figure out who else we're going to tax. He's not going to do that.
In part 2 of my conversation with Chad Warmington, more about Oklahoma's business reputation and the two critical items the energy industry needs from Oklahoma regulators and policymakers to rekindle confidence in the Sooner State.